It is the twin threads, writes Joseph Pearce, woven by the goodness of the saints and the beauty of the arts that witness to God's presence, in contrast to the third dark and twisted thread of pride that witnesses to his absence. All three threads are interwoven in the history of man because they are all interwoven in the heart of man. Joseph Pearce, on his new book, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. A native of England, Joseph Pearce is the internationally acclaimed author of many books, which include bestsellers such as The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, Literary Converts, Wisdom and Innocence, The Life of G.K. Chesterton, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile, and Old Thunder, personal favorite of mine, A Life of Hilaire Belloc. His books have been published and translated into many languages. Joseph has hosted two 13-part television series about Shakespeare on EWTN and has also written and presented documentaries on EWTN regarding the Catholicism of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. His verse drama, Death Comes for the War Poets, was performed off-Broadway to critical acclaim. He has participated and lectured at a wide variety of international and literary events at major colleges and universities in the U.S., Canada, Britain, Europe, Africa, and South America. Joseph is visiting professor of literature at Ave Maria University and visiting chair of Catholic Studies at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. He is editor of the St. Austin Review, series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions, senior instructor with Homeschool Connections, and senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative and Crisis Magazine. Most importantly, his personal website is www.jpearce, that's JPEARCE.co. jpearce, JPEARCE.co. Joseph Pearce, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you, Todd.
Segment 1, Art and the Saints. Pope Benedict XVI once asserted, the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments, namely the saints the Church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. Joseph Pearce, you open your book, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, with this quote. What exactly in your eyes does Pope Benedict XVI mean?
Yes, well, those wonderful words by Benedict XVI were actually a large part of the inspiration from my wanting to write the book, because what I wanted to show that history is not as the progressives would have us believe, an ascent to a so-called golden age of technologically driven utopia in the future, nor is it a regress towards that. But on the contrary, that history is a sort of a time woven tapestry with three threads: the two threads that Pope Benedict mentions, and the absence of them, which is the third thread. So the good are the saints, as he said. The only real defense of the church are the saints. So the presence of goodness, of sanctity throughout history is one of the threads. Then beauty, he says, the great art that's been inspired by the church. That again, this presence of beauty in terms of the visual arts, music, literature, architecture, as being present throughout history, is also something which shines forth the glory of God. And then we have the absence of those things, and that's the bad, the evil, wickedness. So they're the three threads that weave their way through history. And I wanted to show the presence of the good and the beautiful, the two threads to which John, kind of canonizing Benedict for a moment there, Benedict the 16th, that those two threads that he mentions, I want to show their presence in every century since the time of Christ.
I love the notion once again of the it's a matter of presence and absence, right? That so that which is evil, that which is defective, and so on in our nature. It's not that it's a positive aspect. It's just the absence of that which is good and that which is beautiful. But before we dive deeper into this new book, I just want to talk a little bit about your own faith background. What role did the art and the saints play in your own conversion to the Catholic faith, and also the body of work you have produced?
Well, that the great Greek philosophers talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful. So that's if you like, you can see good as caritas, and the true as logos. Um, so I was largely brought to the church initially through logos, in other words, through reason.
Mm.
Went through indirectly from Thomas Aquinas, but really from G.K. Chesterton,
Yeah.
and then later Hilaire Belloc and C.S. Lewis. I was raised to believe, as many people in my generation were raised to believe, that you had to choose between religion or reason. You couldn't have both.
Yeah.
You could be rational, which means you had to abandon the comforts of religion, or you could be religious, but only by abandoning the reality of reason. So Chesterton, who was, of course, really just echoing the scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic philosophers, showed me, on the contrary, fides et ratio, faith and reason were
Mm.
one. So I
Mm.
came to the church, at least this is the way I saw it at the time. With the wisdom of hindsight, I think it was an oversimplification. But I came to the church through the power of an engagement with reason. But I also realized I fell in love with Chesterton. And the reason I fell in love with Chesterton was both because of his goodness, the man, his own personal sanctity and sanity. And we do need to remind ourselves that ultimately sanctity and sanity are the same thing. If
Yes.
sin is ultimately stupid. Um, uh, so we have the goodness of Chesterton, and also we have the beauty of Chesterton, because I loved his use of paradox. I loved the way that he wrote. I love his use of alliteration. So although I didn't see it at the time because I was young and naive, it was the goodness, truth, and beauty
Mm.
of Chesterton that began me on the journey. And then I discovered, of course, the goodness, truth, and beauty of Catholic heritage in a much broader sense subsequently.
I imagine for you, it's only been an enriching or a fuller flowering of your faith as you've discovered those other aspects, the goodness and the beauty that has been kind of built up off of the reason. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Basically, Chesterton got me interested in at least pursuing the idea that God might exist, and then that the church was the mystical body of Christ. But I obviously went on to study uh, Catholic philosophy on a deeper level. And of course, I love literature. I love music. I love
Yeah.
architecture. I love the visual arts. And when I come to realize that basically that art, the beautiful, is part of a triune splendor. The good, the true, and the beautiful are not actually three, or at least they are. If they are three, they're only three in a Trinitarian sense.
Mm.
You can't separate the true and the beautiful from the good. You can't separate the truth from the good and the beautiful. You can't separate the beautiful from the good and the true, because, in some sense, they are one. Goodness is always true and beautiful,
Yeah.
etc. So when I came to understand that, then I began to see that the beauty is the presence of both goodness and truth. Its beauty is rational. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder; it's in the thing beheld.
Mm.
If we don't behold it, it's because of the blindness of the beholder. But there's also if we want to talk about beauty a bit deeper, I see beauty when Jesus Christ says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." I believe that he's basically echoing the philosophy. I am the good, the
Mm.
true, and the
Mm.
beautiful.
Mm.
Obviously the truth is the true, but the way is the way of goodness, the way of love, the way of holiness. But the life is beauty, and because the sunrise has life in it, and we're not talking about biological life. We're talking about the inner harmony of something. So there's beauty in the sunset, but there's life in the sunset.
Mhm.
That is its beauty, but there has to be life in us to perceive it.
Yeah.
So there's actually a relationship, which is a living relationship between the thing behold and the beholder. We have to be as alive as the thing that we're beholding to actually experience the beauty, which is why cynicism, pride, and prejudice close our eyes to beauty.
Very good. One of the things you're going to find to the listeners, I say this. One of the things you're going to find about Joseph Pearce, he is such a prolific writer and an excellent writer that so many aspects of, I think, Joseph, your faith journey have manifested themselves in the topic that you're focusing on in the works that are coming out. So one of my favorite books from you is Wisdom and Innocence, your biography of G.K. Chesterton, which, when I really didn't understand who Chesterton was and was just reading orthodoxy or trying to find my way through orthodoxy, reading Wisdom and Innocence, there was it was clear what an extraordinary life Chesterton had, but also was clear to me that seeing you as an author writing the way you did about Chesterton what a great affection and affinity you had for him. The one other book I want to point people to is your book Race with the Devil, which talks about your own kind of your upbringing and some of your engagements with kind of a nationalist, racist British organization during your youth that you stepped away from, and you left this dark world behind. And I wanted to part of I think the testimony that comes out of that book about your background that's so relevant to nowadays is that we're living in ideological ages that want to have sharp elbows and move God and the true and the good and the beautiful out of the scene. As you write this book, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, how does art and the saints, how does the good and the beautiful serve as somewhat of an antidote to the ideology on offer in the modern world?
Well, I mean, what I'm hoping to show, and that's why I've deliberately have a separate chapter for each of the 20 centuries from the
Hmm.
time of Christ. So the first chapter is actually is the life of Christ, the gospel, and what I try to show there is the template, the pattern for the tapestry of history is actually laid out and all present in the life of Christ. The good, which of course Christ Himself and those who follow Him, um, the bad, and basically throughout history, we can epitomize the evil as either Caesar, which is the power of secularism in every generation, it's ever present, the city of man, as Augustine would say, but also Judas. So that within the church, there's always the either the corrupt uh, people within the church who betray it with a kiss, or the heretics within the church who betray it with a kiss. So, and in every generation, that the good are being persecuted. If they have persecuted me, they will persecute you, says our Lord. So we have this pattern that's laid out in the life of Christ, which we then see played out in every generation and every century. So what I see and try to show is these three threads show, first of all, that the presence of sanctity, the presence of the saints, and their self sacrificial love for Christ is itself the presence of goodness and therefore God in each century, but also that the beautiful is a manifestation of creativity, creation, and God is creator, God is the poet, the composer. Um, the creator, the artist, and all of our own art and poetry and creativity is an expression of the imago Dei in us, the imagination, the imago Dei. So imagination is itself a manifestation of the presence of God within us. So the good and the beautiful shine forth epiphanously the presence of Christ, where of course the bad, the evil, show his absence.
Segment 2: Homo Viator, Homo Superbus, and Anthropus. Homo Viator, Joseph Pearce writes, is pilgrim man. He is the man on the journey of life, which he sees as the quest for heaven, his ultimate and only true purpose. Homo Superbus is proud man. He is the man who refuses the appointed journey, spurning the quest for heaven so that he can do his own thing. Anthropus is poetic man. He is the man who looks up in wonder at the beauty of the cosmos, singing its praises by the making of beautiful things. So, Joseph, did this just come to you, the pilgrim, the proud, and the poetic? Was this something you'd been kind of musing upon, or how did you kind of figure you wanted to create a book that was going to be based on the threads of these three facets of man?
Yeah, well, one of the big mistakes of modern ideology is to try to mechanize reality. So philosophers such as Hegel or Marx see history as some sort of mechanism that's sort of predetermined and predestined because it's the way the machinery of time works and the machinery of economics works and what have you. But in actual fact, of course, history is human. So if you want to understand history, it's the human story through time, the collective human story. Well, each of our own life journeys is an individual history. Um, but history overall is ultimately his story.
Mhm.
It's God's uh, uh, being made manifest through time, through the lives of men. So history is human in this sense. So if history is human, the first thing we have to do if we want to understand history is to understand ourselves. Who are we? And what we are not are these modern concepts of who we are, such as Homo sapiens, sort of scientific man. And Homo sapiens means in Latin wise man, and that's a very, very stupid label for us because if there's one thing that does not characterize human history, it's wisdom. Every generation makes the same mistake as every previous generation because we're too stupid to learn the lessons from the past.
Yeah.
So wisdom does not define us, nor in the sort of Marxist or free market libertarian capitalist sense does the label Homo economicus. That we're only here as sort of factors of production and consumption, along with land and labor and capital. We are the labor part of the land capital aspect of the economy. We're not merely here as economic functionaries. We're much more than that. So who are we? Well, I just went back to older understandings of who we are. The nature of Homo viator, that we are here with a purpose, and that purpose is to unite ourselves with God on a daily basis, that we can be united with Him for eternity in His presence with the beatific vision in heaven. But also Homo superbus, proud man, that we have the right, because of our freedom of will, to refuse that appointed journey.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, that battle, he said, the battle between good and evil takes place in each individual human heart.
Yeah.
So the battle between Homo viator, pilgrim man, the man on the quest for heaven, and Homo superbus, proud man, the man who refuses the quest, takes place in each of our hearts in each day of our lives. Well, if that's true of us as individuals, it's going to be true of us as a society throughout history. So this struggle between Homo viator and Homo superbus is the very struggle of history itself. But then also, I wanted to add anthropos, which is the Greek word for man. And that means, according to Plato's etymology, which is good enough for me, that anthropos means he who turns up, he who looks up in wonder. And what we are called to do, and I derived this from Aquinas, what I call, I mean, it's my terminology, but what I call the five metaphysical senses. This is what anthropos is, that if we have humility, so if we're Homo viator, we have humility, we will also have a sense of gratitude. If we have a sense of gratitude, our eyes will be opened in wonder. If our eyes are opened in wonder, we will be moved to contemplation. And it's only if we move to contemplation that we experience what Aquinas calls dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and the heart into the fullness of reality. So again, five metaphysical senses: humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, dilation. That's what anthropos is. But of course, if you're Homo, you have to be Homo viator for that, the man who has the ability to be a pilgrim. Because if you're Homo superbus, you have no sense of gratitude. You have no sense of gratitude. You have no sense of wonder. You have no sense of wonder. You're not moved to contemplation. If you're not moved to contemplation, you don't experience dilation. You experience the shriveling and shrinking, or what I sometimes call the Golemization of the self. Tolkien's character Gollum in The Lord of the Rings.
To explore this book, and it's beautifully done, and it's I believe close to 300 pages. As you've described earlier, I want our listeners to know, chapter by chapter, it covers 20 centuries, and chapter by chapter, it's broken down between the good, the bad, and the beautiful. And I just want to ask you, given how many things you write, and I presume you're a quick but deep writer, which is a gift. How daunting was it for you to explore the good, the bad, and the beautiful across 2,000 years of human history? And in effect, what I'm wondering is, did you ever arrive, as you're taking this project on, and you arrive at the 7th century and say, sheesh, I got 13 more to go? Was there ever a lag where you're like, there's so much to cover, and I'm going to cover this in 300 pages, and yet it doesn't seem like it's not a skim. It's not it doesn't lack depth as something that surveys 2,000 years of human history. How daunting was this project for you?
Well, when I take on major projects, there are various types of books. Some are easier than others. But when I take on a more daunting prospect, such as this one, where there's obviously I'm trying to survey the whole of the history of Christendom for 2,000 years and encapsulate it in a digestible form for an ordinary reader. That's a daunting prospect, but the metaphor I always use is I love hiking. You said you like my biography of Belloc. One thing I have in common with Belloc is I do love to hike.
Mm,
Now, if you've got a mountain in front of you, you can look at the mountain and think, I don't think I'm up to doing that.
yeah,
Or you simply start climbing.
yeah,
So basically, that I'm not reckless. So I plan the sort of structure of the work, but it'll become alive when I start walking up it. But I just start going,
yeah.
right? 1 mile at a time. If you're hiking up a mountain, one chapter at a time. If you're hiking up a book, so
Yes.
that's the way that I do it. I don't look at the whole thing. So that's a long way to go. I'm just looking to get to that next mile.
How long did it take you to write this, out of curiosity?
Uh, I'm not really sure, but we're talking not talking a huge amount of time. We're probably talking several months research,
Wow.
and several months writing, but not in a full time capacity because I've got so many multifarious other
Yeah.
things I'm doing with traveling, the lecture circuit, teaching, public speaking, editing. So I have to squeeze it in. But so I can basically pretty much guarantee writing a minimum of 2,000 words a day once I
Wow.
start writing. So let's say a 70,000 word book, which I think this is. I mean, that's 35 days work. So that's 7 weeks. Monday to Friday work, but of course it doesn't work out that way because it becomes 6 months because of all the other
Right.
stuff I'm doing.
Just so that again, listeners can know that Joseph used the mountain metaphor. What you'll know about Joseph is that not only is he climbing the mountain and looking at various stages in front of him, he's juggling. He's got he's doing many things at the same time as he's moving up that mountain and still putting out a great work in a short amount of time. It's fantastic. So Joseph, ever since the fall of man and the introduction of original sin, when sin and brokenness were introduced into the world and ourselves, our journey has been hobbled with trials and tribulations. And yet, simultaneously, notwithstanding our fall, we never lost the dignity that comes with being children of God and our hope for salvation. In writing this book, was it simultaneously vexing and hopeful to see so much despair and hope littering the human story?
Well, what it showed me, I mean, this was something I already believed, of course, which is why I'm writing the book. But
Right.
it was confirmed in the process of the writing of it. What it brought home to me is that the whole of history is played out in the present. If you see what I mean, specifically, of course, in God's omnipresence. So for God, there's no past for God, there's no future for God. So the whole of this 20 centuries that I'm writing about is played out in the now of God's
Mm,
presence. And if you understand that, then you realize that all the notions of humanity progressing towards some age where beyond religion or beyond superstition or whatever, where science liberates us from ourselves. This is the stuff of science fiction. But in reality, that the same struggle in every century plays itself out. It doesn't change because humanity doesn't change in the essentials. This struggle between good and evil, in the presence of beauty and ugliness, is the story of man and the story of human history. So, and we also have to understand that within this panoramic collective history of Christendom, we have our own personal human history, our own life journey. And although we don't know when the panoramic collective history is going to end, our life journey will end fairly soon. And all we have to do is keep our own eyes on the end of time, which is
mm,
the end of our own personal lives, because we're just called to be good and faithful servants in active service with the church militant, Miles Christi, soldiers of Christ, until we get the reward at the end if we're good and faithful servants. So we should not be worried about what's going to be happening 200 years from now. That's not what we're meant to be doing. But one of the things that keeps me sane is I try not to be anxious about anything that's beyond my control.
mm,
Well, what's going to be happening? What's happening in the Ukraine today is beyond my control. What's happening in the Gaza Strip today is beyond my control. What's going to happen in the United States in the 22nd century is beyond my
yeah,
control.
yeah.
So I'm not going to get anxious about any of that. I'm going to get anxious about my letting God down if I fall into sin, and
Mm,
my asking for His grace to get me out of that gutter when I find myself in it, so I can start again on the appointed journey as Homo Viator, pilgrim man, towards the finishing line, which for me at my age, We're talking, years and not decades.
It's interesting as you say that. I like that because this really is. I mean, it's a sweeping historical story, but it's very deeply personal. I mean, you see the good, the bad, and the beautiful of humanity in all of these circumstances, and you could bring it down to the good and the bad and the beautiful in your own life. And I think a lot of us who are fans of reading history are always saying, yes, I read it for an escape, and I read it to understand, contextually how things happened or came to be. But simultaneously, I'm reading it a little bit to be inspired, to be instructed, and to live my life in a way that's fuller, richer, and more intentional in the ways of being a good Catholic, a good father, a good husband, etc. So it's a thoughtful piece of history that, yes, again, spans a lot of centuries and a lot of lives, but it can be also have a lot of very personal lessons. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly. I mean, history is one of the most practical things we can study and learn because, history basically shows us where we've been. And if we don't know where we've been, we can't know where we are. And if we don't know where we are, we can't know where we're going.
Yeah.
So literally, it is what orientates us towards getting our bearings as regards who we are and where we are. So and this course is true microcosmically as regards our own lives. If we don't uh, take heed of the journey we've been on as individuals and the lessons we've learned, the mistakes we've made, then we'll continue repeating them.
Yeah.
And what's true of us as individual human persons is true of us as a human society throughout the centuries. If we don't learn lessons, we repeat them, which is why that history is like a tapestry woven with these three, I call them weird
Mm.
woven, it's a weird woven web. Weird, the English word weird, actually in Old English meant something much deeper. It's not just something strange, but it's something basically very much evoking the presence of God.
Mm.
So weird woven web is something supernaturally woven in God's providence. So we are part of a tapestry. So I think in my mind of the Bayeux tapestry in Normandy, which tells the story of the Norman conquest. But we actually have, God Himself weaving this tapestry through the centuries, and we're just part of it. We might straddle 2 centuries. We probably won't last a whole century, and that's part of it. That's part of the also why history is so important, because if we think our own time is all that there is, we cut ourselves off from connections. Well, if we can actually see where we fit and we're a small part of it, then we see ourselves in perspective.
Yeah.
If we think that the now, then this is why the worship of the Zeitgeist instead of the Heidegger Geist, and the spirit of the age instead of the Holy Spirit is so destructive. Because if you think that what's ever happening now is the permanent thing, and it's not the permanent thing, it's the transient thing. You're going to have to look at the whole of history to discover the permanent things.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Study of History. President Harry Truman once observed, "The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know." So, Joseph, a perfect segue from our last segment into this one. How well do we as Catholics know our own history? And you touched on this about why it's important for us to be well versed in that which has preceded us. So, how well do we know it, to your understanding?
Well, I think that one of the problems in our modern culture, and this is part of something we need to do as Catholics to inoculate ourselves against the zeitgeist, against the contemporary culture, is it treats the past with contempt.
Mm.
In fact, it has a sort of superciliously basically psychologically as akin to racism. It looks upon the past as being some primitive race that doesn't have to be taken seriously because obviously, people didn't have cars or couldn't fly in an aeroplane, therefore they're ipso facto they are ignorant barbarians. Now, if I were to go to Africa and go somewhere in the backwoods of Africa and see that the children there were only playing with sticks and perhaps soccer balls, they didn't have iPhones and have all sorts of computer games to play with. And I were to deduce from that that therefore these children in Africa were inferior to me because I do have those things. I would quite rightly be called a racist.
Mm.
But basically, progressives do exactly the same thing. Now, because we have tools that previous generations did not have, therefore we are tools and toys, I should say as well, because many of them are just toys. Tools and toys
Mm.
that previous generations didn't have, therefore they were inferior to us. Well, and therefore, of course, the consequence of that is they don't want to know anything about the past because the past is full of ignorant people
Mm.
and bigots. So you cancel the past, right? That now, if we allow ourselves to be duped by that and are cut off from our roots, then we will just be tumbleweeds as modern people
Yeah,
are.
yeah.
Chesterton speaks about the two types of philosophies: the philosophy of the cloud and the philosophy of the tree. The philosophy of the cloud is relativism. It changes in every single
Mm.
generation. It has
Mm.
no substance. It's blown by the winds of time, by the winds of change, by the winds of fashion, by the zeitgeist, by the time
Yeah,
spirit,
yeah.
spirit of the age. But that which is rooted, the philosophy of the tree, is that's rooted in the permanent things. Those things are always true: the good, the true, and the beautiful; the good, the bad, and the beautiful. So
Hmm.
the bad's always with us, the absence of the good. So these are the permanent things that weave their way through every century of human history, and we have to know that. So if we don't allow ourselves to be rooted, we will be blown around by the winds of the current fashion, and we don't want to do that because, as C.S. Lewis says, um, fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going.
Mm.
So if we're intent on being up to date, the one thing we can be sure of is we're going to be out of date next year. Where someone who's in touch and in tune with the permanent things is never out of date. He basically can converse with Plato and Aristotle and Homer and Shakespeare and Dickens, Dostoevsky, because he's at one with them, because he's understands what they understand, those things which are permanent, that are not blown around by changing fads and fashions.
It's interesting so much of what you say. I think it makes me think of, C.S. Lewis's notion of chronological snobbery, Chesterton's notion, I don't know if it was which day of the week it was, but I'm tired of people who prefer Wednesday to Tuesday simply because it's Wednesday. And the notion that, well, just because we're advancing further into time means we're progressing in the right direction. And Chesterton obviously speaks very eloquently about the notion that progress depends on the standard. You could progress to hell, and that's not a good thing. One other thing you make me think about is in Brideshead Revisited, I think that Charles Ryder was being asked about the quality of art at a date in the distant past, and was saying, yes, this would be considered good quality, and the interlocutor who's talking to him says, well, if it was good then, can't it still be good now? And Ryder was a little bit kind of a relativistic atheist and so on, was taken aback a little bit. So these notions of an anchoring in the permanent things, and B, a sense of defining what do we really mean by progress, or what does it mean to be, just because we're up to date, so to speak, doesn't mean that we are better than we once were. So it's fascinating. There's a guy named Charlie Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Charlie Hill was a diplomat and a professor of grand strategy at Yale. He was interviewed on a program once, and he lamented the dire state of teaching history to college students. As a matter of fact, he was asked to give seminar on some international structure to these fourth years in foreign relations, and was aghast at how much they just fundamentally did not know. And he said they were taught issues and very specific corners of issues instead of history and context. And so they think little of how we got to where we are, and even less of why it matters, and therefore, as you said before, have no idea where we're going to go. Are we plagued? Would you agree with that assessment? Are we plagued in our centers of higher learning with an issue-oriented history, and are we bereft of the sense of context and direction, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, you can't understand any issue unless you understand history.
Yeah.
It's the same. To reiterate what I said, that we can't know where we are unless you know where we've been.
Yep.
So you can't discuss an issue unless you know the context, the background to it, where it's come from, how it's developed, why something is like it is now, how did it become like that. You have to have a knowledge of history, without which you are basically you are impotent to understand the issues. And if you can't understand the issue, you can't address them. So history is essential to actually give us the weapons we need to deal with whatever problems we're struggling with in our own particular generation. And Chesterton said in Orthodoxy, he said that tradition is the democracy of the dead.
Hmm.
It's the uh, proxy of the dead and the enfranchisement of the unborn. So this idea that that if we cut off our ancestors, we're basically becoming dictators, where we say that there's nothing that anybody in the past can say to us that we need to listen to. They don't have a vote, and of course the unborn don't have a vote because we live for today. So the whole point about tradition is it's a continuum. Also, while we're on metaphors, the great South African poet Roy Campbell used the metaphor of a car to describe society, and he says that the accelerator is progress, technological progress. He said the steering wheel is wisdom,
Mm.
and the brakes are tradition.
Hmm.
And he says we live in a culture which refuses to use the brakes and has thrown away the steering wheel and has got its foot hard down on the pedal.
Oh boy, I've never heard that. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So Joseph, tell me this. How does the telling of history with a Catholic sensibility differ from the modern telling of history with what's known as a secular sensibility? And I want to ask you, I want to my cat my moving to the next question that follows that is, um, how have secular historians done at telling church history? The one work that comes to mind right away for me is when John Cornwell wrote Hitler's Pope, kind of that smear of Pius XII. So again, looking at history through the Catholic lens, looking at history through a non-Catholic or secular lens, and then what happens when there's that secular lens that's crossing over, trying to tell the story of Catholicism? What's your sense about that?
Well, as I said, you can only tell the story truly as the story is a human story.
Yeah,
History is a human story about human beings interacting with each other through time. You can only tell that story truly if you understand humanity.
yeah,
So you have to begin with the correct anthropology. You have to begin with understanding who we are. So if you're a materialist, well, apart from the fact you very quickly descend into reduction ad absurdum,
yeah,
but that if we're nothing but matter, then ultimately nothing matters. We end up like Macbeth, so believing that the whole of history and the whole of life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, nihilism, right? So if you have this negative, cynical view of life, then you're not going to see things truly. I mean,
yeah,
obviously there's evil, but there's not only evil. Or you have the other extreme, the progressive optimist, that basically we're not sinners, we're perfect. All we have to do somehow, and sociologically, is mold a perfect society, and there'll be no crime and no misdemeanors. Well, these are all misreadings of anthropology, misreadings of who we are as human beings. So, what is the true vision of who we are? And I think I would rather trust uh, uh, the continuum of Western civilization, from the truth about who we are we can see in stories from Homer, Sophocles, Virgil, Dante,
mhm,
Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Dickens, etc. Uh, and the great philosophers, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas. I'd rather trust these people than those who can't see beyond the age in which they live,
yes.
because they don't think there's anything worth seeing beyond the age in which they live.
Yeah, very good. Joseph, century after century, in the good, the bad, and the beautiful, you celebrate the best the church has to offer without glossing over the sin and corruption that has accompanied it. At times, the warts of bad popes, corrupt cardinals, and wayward priests. It reminds me of Belloc's famous lament, saying that the Catholic Church is an institution he's bound to hold divine, but for unbelievers, a proof of its divinity might be found in the fact that no merely human institution conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight. What does it say about the Catholic Church that it owns its own brokenness while pursuing its salvific mission?
Well, the key thing we have to begin when we start talking about the church, and particularly sinners within the church,
Hmm.
and of course everybody except for Christ and the Blessed Virgin within
Right.
the church are sinners, including the saints. So that we have to begin by distinguishing between the church as the mystical body of Christ,
Hmm.
and the church with respect to its human members. Because the mystical body of Christ transcends its human
Yeah.
members and is not subject to its human members and cannot be destroyed by its human members. The human members will decay and drop off and just be replaced, but the mystical body passes from century to century. So when we talk about the church, we have to make that distinction.
Yep.
The church is not simply human, it's also divine.
Right.
But certainly the human aspect of the church, there have been, and I think that's why the good, the bad, and the beautiful. The bad's not just Caesar. The bad is Judas,
Hmm.
and in every century there have been Judases within the church, weakening the church, not obviously ultimately being able to destroy it, but certainly hampering the church's mission to bring souls to Christ. So that's that. I certainly did not want to gloss over. On the contrary,
Hmm.
I wanted to actually show the dark underbelly of the human aspect of Christianity, because there's always been the Judas in every century.
Yeah, and it's such an important point. I think it's interesting that those that would propose alternative worldviews or frameworks to Catholicism, what you'll find in these ideologies out there that are trying to replace the place of God in their lives, one thing they lack in their system, if you will, is is a penchant for self correction or self criticism. If anything, they kind of sweep things under the rug. And along with that notion, the Catholic Church, I think, in so many respects, is profoundly self critical. I mean, it doesn't mean it has always done perfectly at that, and that's where there's human fallibilities, which are distinct from the truths that the church is infallible on and is the custodian of, and so on. But I do think the notion, again, as fellow Chesterton aficionado, his great quote about the village atheist banging down the doors of the church is going to and yelling hypocrite at the top of his lungs is going to find the Catholics in there on their knees saying the very same thing about themselves. And so as a person that came in late to the faith, I was heartened by the notion that you're in here because you're a sinner. It has the means by which it can salve your sins through the sacraments and the graces. But at the same time, it also it recognizes that the humanity part of the faith has brokenness, whereas you can still have the church still is the custodian of the eternal and infallible truth at the same time. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, and that's why we cling to the church, because the church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. That's why we don't leave the church because of Judas's within it,
Yeah.
because the church is not the Judas. The church is Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
and so you don't desert Christ because of the treachery of Judas. On the contrary, that's the encouraging thing about it. That we do know that and Belloc is completely correct that in fact the fallibility of her members is one of the biggest arguments for the divinity of the church as the mystical body of Christ. The church would not have survived if she had only been a human institution, because there have been so many Judases in positions of power at crucial times that really the whole thing should have come tumbling down. And the fact that it hasn't is proof of Christ's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail.
So Joseph, as you're telling this story. So say a person who comes who has no faith in God and is not a Catholic, and they pick up your book and they read it. How does uh, how does the church and its members seeking to evangelize others? how do we help people recognize what you and I have just described? And that is that, um, albeit there's incredible brokenness among its members, there's the saving graces of its sacraments. Because it seems like the world itself, as soon as it hears any tinge or taint of scandal or brokenness among the church's members, is ready just to dismiss it out of hand. And yet there's this profound truth that transcends our brokenness. And in fact, again, our brokenness is why we are members of the church, to be bathed and washed free from sin in the truth of Christ, in the graces of Christ. How do we do a better job in evangelizing those who are unschooled, untutored, unpracticed in the faith? That, yes, we do own that brokenness, but that's not the whole story. What does one do to break through the other side? And maybe your book is a one of the many points to do that, which is, here's the bad. I'm not going to not represent it, but don't miss the good and the beautiful. What's your sense about that?
Well, my immediate response to that would be to sort of to say, well, let's just leave church absence of church to one side, and let's just talk about gossips.
Mm,
If someone is always looking at the bad things that other people are doing and gossiping about it to others, and never seeing the good things that they do, and as and when or if they do, don't bother to comment upon it, because this is the news media generally, of course, it's the
yeah.
bad news that they're interested in, not the good news. You'd think that person was a bad and negative influence. So anybody who's looking at the Catholic Church and is blind to all the great things done by saints over the centuries, or all the great beauty that's shone forth in terms of architecture, art, music, literature. They're the gossip. They only really want to see the bad thing that someone's doing and don't want to turn a blind eye to all the good things. If you want to be fair, you have to actually look at the whole picture. And in actual fact, if anything, try to give the benefit of the doubt to those at least trying to be good, even if they fall sometimes.
Yeah, well said. Segment 4, the tiny bit. Gary Saul Morrison, Northwestern's Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities, once noted, quote, "Radicals and romantics picture life in terms of dramatic events. The ordinary instants between crises are viewed as trivial or despised as bourgeois. Tolstoy and Chekhov believe the opposite. Life is lived at ordinary moments, and what is most real is what is barely noticeable, like the tiny movements of consciousness." Leo Tolstoy explains with an anecdote. The painter Brylyov once corrected a student's sketch. "Well, you only touched it a tiny bit," the student remarked. "But it is quite a different thing." Brylyov replied, "Art begins where that tiny bit begins." Close quote. So, Joseph, in exploring the good, the bad, and the beautiful, you don't simply focus on dramatic events, of which there are many. Nero's persecutions, the writing of Dante's Divine Comedy, the Battle of Lepanto, but you also zoom in on the prosaic, on the tiny bits of history. And so, I just wanted to see if you could just say a few words about some of these things. A few that jumped out at me. One is the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia in the 3rd century and its ultimate impact on music. Could you say a word or two about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the challenge one has when one's writing a book of this sort is you're looking at a panoramic landscape of 2,000 years,
Yeah.
and I was trying to keep each century, each chapter, one chapter per century, trying to keep to around 3,000 words or thereabouts, between 3 and 4,000 words, because that's a good length for someone to be able to read for 15 minutes and finish a chapter.
Yeah.
I didn't want to intimidate the reader. So that means, of course, you do have to be selective, but you have to be selective in a way which does not violate objectivity.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in the case of Saint Cecilia, the most important thing about her was the fact that she was a martyr and that she's in heaven.
Mm,
But what I talk about in the novel, in the context of the history, is the fact that she is in the beauty of the story of her martyrdom, as told, has become the inspiration for great works of beauty through
mm,
the centuries. In other words, that we are meant to be inspired by goodness and beauty to make to be good and to make beautiful things ourselves. In other words, we're meant to inspire each other. And I think that's what's Cecilia's single act of devotion, if you like, in laying down her life for her Lord in martyrdom, is a catalyst, right? Which then has multifarious
Mhm.
ramifications throughout the centuries, and that's the perfect example of how as going back to where we began with Pope Benedict XVI. You know that basically that the argument for the church are the saints she's produced and the great works of beauty that
Yeah.
she's inspired. But
Yeah.
in this case, we have a saint she's produced that's actually inspiring these great works of beauty.
Yeah, this was amazing to me, and I love the way you said that. Let's start by talking about that she's martyred in heaven. I mean, there's no higher end than that in and of itself, and it's easy to kind of get for me and many others kind of get caught up in well, what are the historical ramifications of this? But again, in the death of Saint Cecilia, and this is what just kind of blew me away as the patron saint of music, and this is from The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful. As the patron saint of music and musicians, she has played a major role in the history of music, proving inspirational to some of the greatest composers and some of the finest poets. These composers who have written music in her honor include Marc Antoine Charpentier, Henry Purcell, Alessandro Scarlatti, George Frederick Handel, Joseph Haydn, and the list goes on and on. And then obviously Chaucer, Dryden, Pope, Auden, and so it's what might be I'm not very familiar with Saint Cecilia. What might seem to be some quiet, historically quiet death and martyrdom, which has ramifications echoing throughout the vaults of heaven, had significant earthly ramifications to some of the greatest masters of music historically. And I just love the fact that a story like that makes its way in the midst of the Neros and the grand schemes or the grand accomplishments and the grand tragedies or scandals throughout history. Another one I want to mention was the founding of Cluny Abbey in the year 910 and kind of the renaissance of the church. Could you just say a word or two about that?
Yeah, again, this is something which should inspire us. That often it's at the darkest moments in the church's history where she seems to have lost her way or lost her power, to be powerless, to have secular enemies that seem far too powerful to resist. It's ordinary people on the ground at grassroots level that start the restoration. So
Mm,
before Cluny, of course, there was Benedict. Um, but they founded the Cluniac priories in the 10th century. Now, I give the figures in the book, if I recall correctly,
yeah.
about the growth of the Cluniac movement. But you see here how something just begins at grassroots level, and then it just takes off like a wildfire of grace across the landscape of Christendom. And we've seen that again throughout history. I gave a talk yesterday evening here on campus at RMU University about the Catholic literary revival, which really begins with the publication of lyrical ballads by Coleridge and Wordsworth in 1798. 1798, the Catholic faith is dead in England. There's been 300 years of persecution. There's only a few tens of thousands of Catholics left. Yet through the rise of Romanticism, we get neo-medievalism, we get the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, we get the Gothic revival in architecture, we get the Oxford movement within the Church of England, which spawns the conversion of St. John Henry Newman. And by the end of that, 100 years later, we have a Catholic revival, not just in the arts, which is profound, Newman, Hopkins, and in the 20th century, Chester, Bell, etc.
Yeah.
But we have a growth of the number of Catholic churches is 10 times what it was centuries before. The number of Catholic schools is 10 times what it was. So the church is dead. As Chesterton says, that the Catholic Church has died many times, and it's risen again because it worships a God and knows the way out of the grave. So I think that we see here that example of England at the end of the 18th century, or continental Europe, France at the beginning of the 10th century. The times of weakness are moments of renewal and rebirth.
Mm.
That this is the glory of the church's history.
It's an amazing. I love the fact that in each one of these examples, you can not only speak to it specifically, but also bring the moral of the story. I want to on this Cluny Abbey. Just again, there would be only 7 abbots in the first 250 years of Cluny's existence, all of whom were canonized or beatified. And during this same period, there were no fewer than 48 popes, most of whom were not saintly examples in their to their flock. But three of the greatest popes of this period, Gregory the Seventh, Urban the Second, and Paschal the Second, were all monks of the Cluniac order, and it goes on. One other example, if you don't mind, last one I promise, was the ordination mission of Saint Louis de Montfort in the 18th century and the impact on the consecration to Jesus through Mary. Could you say just a few words about that?
Yeah, and again, the same thing. This is 18th century France is a place of decadence,
Yeah.
right? And it's so it's decadent culturally, it's decadent morally. It's the age of absolutist monarchs, not just in France but across Europe, who are basically trying to nationalize the church. They're basically deciding who can be ordained and what sacraments can be uh, practiced and in what ways. The church, you have this big governments France and elsewhere, they trying to impose their secular will. So Caesar is trying to seize the church amidst a backdrop of moral anarchy, hedonism, decadence. And in the midst of this, you have this saint who calls for us to come to Christ through his mother. And that devotion, again, just like the Cluniac Priories, it's a wildfire that takes off across France and then across the world. So again, it's exactly at the times where it seems that Caesar or Judas have triumphed, that somehow or other God plants the seeds of faith in great saints, great movements within the church, and we see this resurrection from the dead, shall we say?
To that point, and also back to that Bella quote about the divine nature of the church in light of its resilience. It is striking. You read this book, and you're like, there's without the notion of the gates of hell not prevailing against the church, the promise that the church will live on. Um, it's almost impossible for a person not to read this and say, well, this is it. It's going to be the end. It's all going to be snuffed out. And then as soon as something is collapsing, God's work springs up in 10 other places. I mean, it's the glorious, it's the sacred Hydra, where a head gets cut off and up spring, seven others or what have you. But it's almost eerie. It's profound, and somewhat eerie how this God is truly delivering on that notion that they're going to come at us with guns blazing, and we are not going to collapse. We will outlive this, and the church will go on. I want to ask you, Joseph, when you're researching this, were there seasons of church history that you found particularly intriguing, inspiring, and instructive? And were there seasons that were just difficult for you to read?
Well, I think the one thing that it showed me was that each century was remarkably similar
Mm,
in terms of this tapestry. So you mentioned about the fact, and one of the things I hope about this, it will give encouragement to people that think we're living in the worst of times, right? Really, if we should play it, what my challenge is we should put a blindfold on and get a dart, right? And there's a wall with any date in the last 2,000 years on it. You get blindfold yourself, throw a dart, and it lands somewhere. And you go to that particular decade
mm.
in human history, and you will find that it's both has the good and the bad and the beautiful. There's nothing very different about it. And one thing I found, which is paradoxical, the so-called best of centuries, like the 13th century, the High Middle Ages, the founding of the Franciscan order, Dominican order, the opening of the universities, scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Albert the Great, time of glory, right?
Yeah.
But it's also a time of the sacking of Constantinople, of Christian crusaders besieging for purely avaricious reasons Christian cities on in a so-called crusade. Um, the rise of Islam, of course, and the church at the end of the 13th century is so weak, shall we say, that by the early 14th century, very quickly there were three people claiming to be pope at the same time. And at the time there'd be no real way of knowing which was the bona fide pope.
Mm.
So it's just after the so-called best of centuries, we have one of the worst moments. And for me, as regards favorite centuries, paradoxically, these are the centuries you might think are bad. The 16th century, well, it's the time of the Protestant rupture, but it's also the time of the Council of Trent, the time of the Catholic Reformation, with these glorious, the founding of the Jesuit order, the renewal of the Carmelite order under St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, the spreading of the faith to the new worlds. Um, and then the 19th century, just after the French Revolution, 1800, you think the church is dead. I mean, even the Pope himself, under pressure from Caesar, has banned the only
Yeah,
fighting part
yeah,
of the church,
yeah.
the Jesuits. It's over, it's dead. By 1900, you have the Catholic Church is expanding. I mean, in the United States, UK, throughout the Americas. So, anybody who thinks that we're living in the worst of times and Armageddon is imminent, it's, again, because they're ignorant of history.
Yeah. Very good. By the way, this is a gauntlet thrown down for all those filmmakers who are out there listening. This book will point you to the scripts that you're ready to write about innumerable studies of the good, the bad, and the beautiful throughout history, within and without the Catholic Church. Joseph, I want to ask you one last question. I know you have to run, but one last question is. How have you been personally affected by your deep exploration of the good, the bad, and the beautiful in the history of the Catholic Church?
Well, insofar, of course, as any engagement with reality leads us closer to reality himself,
Mm,
a deeper understanding of history that I've managed to attain through my research and writing this book has led me closer to the goodness, truth, and beauty of Jesus Christ. So, as in all uh, seeking after truth, we are moved closer to truth himself. So I feel that my faith has been deepened through my engagement with the history of Christendom for the last 2,000 years.
wonderful. Joseph, can you give us a teaser as to what's next for you, or is it under lock and key?
I have a book coming out, which is I wrote a series for Crisis Magazine, putting 50 great books in a nutshell, where I try to
Mm,
encapsulate great works of literature in 1,000 words or so. That's going to be published sometime, I imagine this year by Ignatius Press. I'm not sure what the title will be, but it's basically great literature in a nutshell.
wonderful. Be sure to visit Joseph at www.jpearce, that is JPEARCE.co. Joseph Pearce, a Catholic convert, evangelist, and author of The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Todd, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. God bless you.
Thank you. So I've been thinking. President Harry S. Truman once admitted, "The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know." So I imagine that in writing The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, Joseph Pearce was intent on telling us a few things we didn't know. And he succeeded. As I mentioned in our conversation, who knew that the martyrdom of St. Cecilia, the founding of the Cluny Abbey, and the mission of St. Louis de Montfort could all be so consequential and yet so easily forgotten? What isn't forgotten, however, is the messiness that comes with being human and our desperate need for support, correction, and redemption through Christ and his church. Within each one of us is the pilgrim, the proud, and the poet, seeking direction, shirking our duties, and singing God's praises. Each figure within oscillates, at once larger and at other times smaller, and history is better or worse because of it. But through it all is the church, holding mystical truths in mortal hands. The church seeks to accompany us, dispense the sacraments, and usher us brilliantly into eternity. And when the church does it right, history sparkles. G.K. Chesterton once concluded, quote, "There is no other case of one continuous intelligent institution that has been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years. Its experience naturally covers nearly all experiences, and especially nearly all errors. The result is a map in which all the blind alleys and bad roads are clearly marked, all the ways that have been shown to be worthless by the best of all evidence, the evidence of those who have gone down them." Close quote. In fact, Chesterton would continue, quote, 9 out of 10 of what we call new ideas are simply bad mistakes. The Catholic Church has for one of her chief duties that of preventing people from making those old mistakes, from making them over and over again forever, as people always do if they are left to themselves. Close quote. In the grand landscape of history, mankind's mistakes and blunders are all too apparent. But we shouldn't let our brokenness blind us to moments of deep faith soaring heroism, and sublime grace. After all, God's creation and man and woman in it is still good. Perhaps in reapproaching our history, we can be transformed. Perhaps we can see the outlines of grace in the midst of suffering. Perhaps we can savor exquisite beauty even in the dankest of trenches. And even as we stumble, perhaps we can take a bit of encouragement from the words of Winston Churchill. Quote, "History with its flickering lamp stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this? The only guide to man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. It is very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we march always in the ranks of honor." Close quote. But I would offer a corrective to Sir Winston. Only with a conscience formed by the precepts of Christ and a rectitude and sincerity in keeping with the faith of his saints will we march always in the ranks of honor. And perhaps in doing so, we will change history. And one last thing. To be sure, read Joseph Pearce's sweeping book, The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful. But I would also like to recommend two poems, The Black Cottage and Birches from Robert Frost. Each explores the past with nostalgia for times past and truths obscured. As Frost writes, most of the change we think we see in life is due to truths being in and out of favor. Today, let us hold fast to unfashionable truths and seek to live out a noble history. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.